Welcome everybody to our penultimate talk of the term. So today we have Dr. Andrew Dowling with us, who's going to be talking about the prospects for Catalan independence. Now, Dr. Dowling is teaching at the University of Cardiff, teaching Spanish history. So I think without further ado, I'll hand over to you, Dr. Dowling, and just give us a brief little introduction of sort of your field, and then feel free to launch right into it.
Okay, right. Well, thank you very much for the introduction. Thank you very much for inviting me. It's a real pleasure on my part to be part of this series of talks and participate in debates of these kind, because, you know, hopefully talking, debating, discussing, arguing is how we can sort of deal with so many of the issues that confront us today. So I'm not really going to say too much about myself, apart from to note that I've worked really on the question of Catalonia for probably 25 years in total. I did my PhD on it. And to be honest, I was pretty much working in a relative backwater until the 1st of October 2017, by which I mean the Catalan issue was kind of really an issue for kind of specialists, to be honest. Most people knew very little about it unless they were, you know, generally interested in, say, Spanish politics or Spanish history. And most of the time, you wouldn't really see much, even in the serious British newspapers. So people maybe if they like football, they knew about Barcelona Football Club. But obviously, something happened on the 1st of October 2017, which is what I'm going to come to, and is the kind of the start of my talk. So the first thing I want to say about what I'm going to be speaking about is that I'm not going to give too much detail at all on parties, organizations, individuals. I think, unless I'm mistaken, I don't mention a single individual or a single political party by name, because what I wanted to do is to make this firstly accessible, broad brush, sort of thematic. And I'm very happy, of course, if people want more detail, to feel free to ask me later. You know, somebody who knows quite a bit about this, I'm very happy to answer in those terms. But I've kept it sort of general, but hopefully still of interest even to those people who have pretty deep knowledge of it. So as I kind of mentioned, I was working really in an area that I was very interested in, I was fascinated in, but it didn't really have international projection, or it wasn't really on most people's radar. And that changed, of course, on the 1st of October 2017. What happened on the 1st of October 2017? Well, we saw on our screens intense scenes of police violence in the streets of Barcelona, in the streets of Catalonia. Just 3 images here, 1st of October, where the Spanish authorities sent in their police forces to stop a referendum on independence. And that day, the 1st of October 2017, really is what I'd call a kind of inflection point, a before or after moment, because people suddenly became aware of the Catalan issue. That was a news day, I believe it was a Sunday, that story filled the news bulletins. Obviously, you know, images of police and of that kind, dramatically striking innocent, unarmed protesters is powerful visually, is powerful television, and it became a global news story. And I think people were genuinely shocked that this was happening in a member state of the European Union. They were genuinely shocked to see that it was happening in a country like Spain, where, you know, opinion polling and data evidence show that most people in Europe have or had a very positive image of Spain. Most people, perhaps even amongst many of you, have been to Spain in some way, shape, or form, and the vast majority of people who go to Spain seem to really enjoy what it has to offer culturally, socially, etc. So it was a shock. It was a shock to a global audience, and it was a global news story. And then, as a consequence of what happened on the 1st of October 2017, the Catalan question became a key theme in contemporary Europe. And people started to ask, what's going on there? People, you know, who didn't have much background knowledge began to wonder, how do we explain what has brought about this situation? And I was, I suppose, in a fortunate position where I was one of the few people in the UK who they could call upon. So I did get a number of calls, and sometimes at a very simple level, asking me, what's this Catalan question? What's this Catalan issue? So this Catalan question then has posed an incredible challenge to Spain. If we leave aside COVID, it's been the greatest political crisis experienced by Spain since the death of the dictator Franco in the middle of the 1970s. Okay, so Franco died in his bed on the 20th of November 1975. And I think one of the interesting things to note about the Catalan question is, those of you know anything about 20th century Spain, or perhaps the Franco dictatorship or the Spanish Civil War or any of that, will know that there were once intense divisions in Spain around religion, around the monarchy, around class conflict, political violence. And most of those issues have been reasonably resolved. They're still kind of sources of political dispute, but just like in British politics and British political culture, there are lots of divisions that we argue about, but they're not dramatic divisions. Whereas what's interesting about the case of Spain is that the question of the nation, the question of national identity, still is unresolved, which has meant that in the 21st century, the Spanish state, the Spanish system, is subject to profound change by those in Catalonia seeking independence. So really then, the 1st of October 2017 is a turning point, and it's what we can call an inflection point. It's a before and after moment. The violence, the police violence that day, confirmed the alienation of many in Catalonia. It confirmed their alienation from Spain, from the Spanish authorities, from Spanish nationhood. Why did this event happen? Why did this violent attempt on the part of the police to break up a civilian organised referendum? Well, firstly, the Catalan government had called a referendum for independence on that day, the 1st of October 2017, but the Spanish government had said that this referendum was illegal, and therefore they sent in the police the morning of October 2017, 1st of October, to break up all attempts at holding of the referendum. That violence that happened that day, in one sense, was a kind of comedy of errors, or more accurately, a tragedy of errors, because prior to the referendum on the 1st of October, the Spanish government had sent thousands of police to Catalonia to prepare them to stop the referendum. They were held in cruise ships, just outside the port of Barcelona, and I think they were pretty isolated. You basically had thousands of men with high levels of testosterone, really, cooped up for weeks. And on the 1st of October, the morning of the 1st of October 2017, they were unleashed into hostile crowds. Interestingly, in the case of Spain, and perhaps we see more of this in our own political culture as well, nobody took responsibility for what happened. Nobody in Spain took political responsibility for these scenes of police violence. No government minister resigned. No government minister has even engaged in self-criticism. So what I'm going to do in this sort of brief talk is first give a few sort of pointers to how we got here. How did we get to the Catalan question becoming such a major issue? Note briefly, in a different sense than what I've already stated, how the 1st of October 2017 and its consequences. And finally, to sort of answer what I've posed, is Catalan independence on the horizon? Is it certain? Is it likely? Or is it highly improbable. So moving along then, how did we get there? How did we get to this point? Well, I think the first thing to know and to frame what we're thinking about is the economic crisis since 2008 has changed the vectors of politics everywhere. And it's clearly given a push towards pro-independence movements in territories like Scotland, in Catalonia, in Flanders, in Belgium. So what we've seen in Catalonia is clearly happening in other places. Spain historically has got a number of kind of regional or subnational issues. For most of the period since the 1970s, it's been the Basque question, but the Basque question is now relatively calm, but a bit like one of those Fisher-Price toys for children. When you knock down one element, another one pops up. So the Basque question is calm, is quiescent, but now the Catalan question has popped up. And it is the Catalan question that is the epicenter, the center of Spain's crisis. So we should situate the Catalan question within the context of Spain, but also situate it within the wider context of things happening around us and in other European societies. Mention the economic crisis. I think it's important to talk about things like a crisis of political representation, other issues like the intensity of political emotions, such as frustration, optimism, anger, and I think those three emotions in particular we see expressed in the case of Catalonia. Catalonia is a historically wealthy region, and it's got a profound sense of its own national and cultural identity. And as it developed, secession or the push for independence in Catalonia became what I call the solution that many people saw as solving the problems of its society. I think, and I want to be careful how I kind of state this, that you don't misinterpret me. I think there are some elements that are clearly populist within Catalan independence, by which I mean that it shares some features with other movements in Europe, whether on the left or of the right. I do not, when I state that it has some elements of populism, I do not mean that it is a right-wing political movement, and I want to make sure that nobody thinks that's what I'm talking about. But it has a certain notion, a certain framing, a conception of the people, which is central, of course, to populism. You know, that's where the word comes from. And it's clear that since 2008, a whole range of movements, including Brexit, have been attempts at reclaiming political sovereignty, reclaiming economic sovereignty. So we see these themes being played out in a wide range of areas. We've also seen the rise and expression in different forms of what we can call economic patriotism around the economy, around the defense of the economy, about preserving the economy or ensuring that what the riches we have are shared amongst what we can call our own. So these themes of sovereignty, these themes to kind of to preserve or to restore have clearly been themes that we've been seeing elsewhere. I think the Catalan question is another further example in political history and political development, where it clearly demonstrates that national identity once again triumphs over what we can call pure class politics. So much of the 20th century is about class conflict or class politics. It's clear that the question of identity has an incredibly important framing in this question. It's pretty obvious again, you know, think again in the case of the UK, the failures of, say, Corbyn's Labour Party. In general terms, the political left has been unsuccessful to respond to many of these themes. It doesn't seem to have, it's not comfortable with narratives around the national community, the nation, the defence of national identity, and it's clear that others have been able to move in and to occupy this terrain. So why has the nation or nationalism been so important in this context? Well, I think nationalism, in one sense, it's an incredibly powerful force because it binds people together. It provides what I'd call a social glue to society, and it moves beyond those internal differences of, say, north-south and urban and rural. It posits, or it suggests, that there is some greater unity that we can all to aspire to. So Catalan independence is an incredibly successful political movement in the sense of its effectiveness, but it's also a failure because it hasn't achieved its primary objective, which is, of course, the independence of Catalonia. But I'm going to come to that component later in the talk. So, moving along then, there's nothing inevitable. There has been nothing inevitable about what we can call the turn to independence in Catalonia. And in fact, I really want to reiterate this for those perhaps who are not fully familiar with the question, that it's a relatively new movement. It's a relatively new political expression. As late as around 2003, 2004, 2005, support for Catalan independence was barely 10%. And in fact, at that time, Catalonia was spoken about as a role model for successful devolution, in the British term, as having a successful devolved government, a successful devolved administration. And lots of scholars and others were using the Catalan case as an example of a success story, often in contrast to the question of the Basque Country, where there was a continuing campaign of political violence. So it had this kind of strange attraction almost, and that very little seemed to be going on there. Catalonia seemed to be moving along quite happily. We could also note that into the 1990s, not a single member of the Catalan Regional Parliament was openly in favour of independence. I mentioned that, independent support was barely 10% at the end of the century. And if you look back at, say, some of the literature, if you look back what was being written about in Catalonia, there was no real reason to think that Catalonia was about to embark on a dramatic break with its own political tradition, its own political culture, and embrace this new movement of independence. So this seems to be a dramatic rupture. And I think here it's helpful again to think about some of the wider developments that are also happening in Europe. For example, the party system in Catalonia was incredibly turbulent, prone to change, generational change, new generations coming to voting age, and traditional political loyalties, which we've seen kind of stable until the 1990s, were beginning to fray. So we can look back and trace some of the elements that will become important. I think in one sense, wages, salaries, working conditions had stagnated for a substantial part of the working population, the working class population, since the 1980s. But that kind of stagnation in wages was not really visible to most people because of credit. So the credit boom of the 1990s, essentially people kind of, having credit cards and living kind of fantastic lives on credit, delayed the recognition that things weren't as quite as positive as they led to believe by their use of a credit card. And I think this delayed what I'd call a recognition that amongst the Catalan middle classes, things were beginning to deteriorate. And in my view, what I call the Catalan independence movement is, it's a middle class revolt. It's a middle class rebellion. And I'm happy to come back to that, of course, and talk about it in more detail. So political identity then is increasingly frayed. It's increasingly in flux. People no longer have the same loyalty to political parties that their parents did. We've seen this, for example, just in December 2019 in the British general election, where in the north of England, for the first time in history, whole swathes of the north broke with political tradition, didn't vote for Labour, they voted for the Conservative Party. So all these elements, all these kind of mechanisms that we used to use to interpret what's going on in any society are increasingly up for grabs, up for consideration. So we begin to see that. And the economic crisis gives an incredible push to some of these measures as well. The second thing to note is what I'd call the development of Spanish nationalism, the development of Spanish conservatism and Spanish nationalism, which normally go together. from around the middle of the 1990s until 2004, we get a pretty right-wing conservative government come to power in Spain that is increasingly concerned the powers that are accruing to the different regional governments in Spain. So Spain has what we can call a semi-federal system of 17 regional parliaments. We know that just last week Boris Johnson referred to the disaster of the Scottish Parliament. So you've got a similar kind of expression, increasing frustration amongst Spanish nationalists and Spanish conservatives that these regional parliaments are posing a threat to the unity of Spain. So we begin to see what I call a pushback. So the Catalan problem, as it becomes a problem, begins in Madrid, not in Barcelona. It begins in Madrid because the conservative government in Madrid decides to try to impose the limits of how much autonomy these regional governments have. So there's kind of these things are sort of happening on the back burner. Some of them are perhaps of greater importance than others. And at the same time, we have this other movement, which is Catalonia received its own regional parliament, so like Scotland in British terms, in 1980. And there was a growing consensus in Catalan society in the late 1990s, early 2000s, that they needed to update it, needed to renew it. So this was called the Project for a New Statute of Autonomy. So it's kind of like, again, for a British audience, giving the Scottish Parliament more powers. And this formed part of the political debate in the early years of the 2000s. However, this met with incredible resistance from Madrid. Okay, so we have an increasing kind of rise in political tension between a Catalan attempt to obtain more regional powers and a centralizing sentiment in Madrid that is highly resistant to giving away anything else. A belief that we've gone far enough in this question of devolution. So we get what we can call an increasing clash between an assertive Spanish nationalism and a kind of Catalan movement that is on the back burner, is on the defensive. And all this culminates in a decision of the Spanish Supreme Court, which strikes down important measures. So again, to put it into a British context, so the Scottish Parliament says, we want these new powers. They're agreed by the British Parliament. Then the British Supreme Court says, no, they're illegal. And that's what happens in the case of Spain. The Spanish Supreme Court strikes down these measures. And this leads to the first real protest in Catalonia in July 2010. So 10 years ago, we get over 1 million people on the streets of Barcelona campaigning for what they call, we are a nation, we should decide. And this is the first popular expression that something has changed, that we're now beginning to enter a crisis. Remember that this is 2010, 2 years earlier, the economic crisis had begun, and the economic crisis arrived with incredible intensity in Spain. It wasn't quite as bad as Greece, but after Greece, Spain was one of the worst hit countries in Europe. So you get all these kind of different sort of rivers flowing together, if you want, think of it about it in that kind of image, and the economic crisis gives even greater intensity to this. So suddenly we get an explosion of support for Catalan independence, which spirals from 10, 12, 13, 14% in 2005 to figures approaching half of the Catalan population by 2015. So Catalan independence has suddenly gone from being on the political margins to becoming part of the mainstream. Subsequently, year after year, and I'm just going to briefly give you some of the powerful images that we see, year after year, 2012, every September, 2012, 2013, 2014, 15, 16, 17, 18, we see vast political demonstrations in Catalonia, often with more than 1 million people campaigning for Catalan independence. So it's clear that something dramatic, something profound has changed. And the movement for independence becomes the single biggest political pressure in the political culture. It's clear that the traditional model, if you want, of Spanish relations that has existed since the 1970s has broken. And now we're going to see carried out really a clash, a collision. A collision is increasingly being established, the collision is increasingly being set between Spanish nationalism and Catalan nationalism. And here we see, for example, this was introduced in the early 2000s as a kind of an expression, as an assertion of Spanish identity, a giant Spanish flag. So Spanish nationalism is also in the ascendant. So Catalonia is increasingly alienated. And for a variety of reasons, haven't really got time to go into, but you've seen those visual images of the powerful demonstrations in the street, and they're not organized by political parties. They're organized by organizations of civil society. And there's an increasing and growing demand in Catalan society for a referendum on independence. Why a referendum? Well, a referendum, of course, is perceived to give legitimacy to a debate, to an argument. It's seen as the way of resolving an issue. Of course, we have the example of Scotland in 2014. So the Catalans are saying, well, if Scotland had one in 2014, we want a referendum too. You also had the example of Quebec, which held 2 referendums on independence as well. So as part of this push from the street, the Catalan government holds what it calls a pseudo, well, it doesn't call it, but I'm calling it a pseudo referendum in November 2014, which basically the Spanish government tolerated because it was clear that it only had symbolic value. And about 40% of the Catalan population participated in this referendum, and they overwhelmingly expressed support for independence. After this moment in 2014, there continues to be this push for a real referendum. The Spanish government repeatedly refuses to hold a referendum on independence. So we get to the point where in 2017, the Catalan government says, right, we're going to organize our own referendum. And I think in this context, thinking about Spain and its refusal to allow a legal referendum for whether the Catalans can continue to be part of Spain or not, I think it's important to note that Spanish unity, the question of the unity of the territory, of Spanish national unity, is deeply embedded in the country. So the question of whether Catalonia might be independent one day is what I would call, it's an existential question for Spain. It's not a simple, perhaps a political transactional question like it might be whether Scotland becomes independent in the case of Britain. No Spanish government will ever willingly accede to the loss of 20% of its economy. And that's what Catalonia represents. But it is also a really profound, a deeply profound emotional attachment on the part of most Spaniards to their national territory. So back to this referendum then. Catalan government, as I mentioned, says it's going to go ahead and hold its own referendum on the 1st of October 2017. And if victory is obtained, it will declare independence within 48 hours. Therefore, on this occasion, the Spanish government says it's going to do all in its power to stop and prevent this referendum. And I refer you back to the images I began with the police violence to stop that referendum. So what we had on the 1st of October 2017 was what I would call a sort of referendum. It was partly prevented from being a real referendum because of the police action that day, but also because a majority part of the Catalan population boycotted it. So people who were opposed to independence didn't participate in it. So that kind of eroded its legitimacy as well. So the referendum didn't achieve the result it hoped. And I think that was partly because the referendum also meant different things to probably 3 different sectors within the Catalan independence movement. Firstly, I think some sectors within Catalan independence wanted the referendum as a measure, as a lever to achieve concessions from Spain. So they said they wanted independence, but would accept concessions. That's why they pushed for the referendum on independence. For another sector, the holding of the referendum was a mechanism to achieve international pressure on Spain. And in one sense, they achieved the international attention, which was incredibly damaging to the international image of Spain. So the idea would have been that they would have achieved some kind of international pressure or even international intervention was hoped for that would force Spain to the negotiating table. Finally, and for many voters of that day, it was a real referendum and it should lead to independence. And I would call this category who interpreted the referendum in this way, what I'd call them are the true believers. They really believed it was a real referendum for independence. The problem was, and the problem is, that even though ultimately the Catalan Parliament declared Catalan independence on the 27th of October 2017, not one country in the world recognized it, and that hasn't changed 3 years on. Nobody accepted their self-organized referendum as providing any kind of legitimacy. And therefore, after the 1st of October 2017, we have a kind of reckoning, a reconsideration of what everything means. One key belief for Catalan independence until 2017 is that it's going to be easy to leave Spain. It's very, this might sound exaggerated on my part, but if you go back and look at all the things the supporters and the leading figures are saying, that as far as they're concerned, Catalan independence is imminent. It's in the bag. We just need to complete this referendum. So there are many areas of serious miscalculation, serious misinterpretation going on. It wasn't easy, and it isn't easy to leave Spain. And I think in this context, about the likelihood of a future Catalan independent state, I think we should note that Britain and Canada are highly unusual in global politics, in that they are two of the very few countries in the world that accept a negotiated route to independence. The vast majority of existing states in the United Nations consider secession, consider separating from their national territory to be a crime. And in many countries, that unity, that national unity, is expressed in the constitution. So the examples include not only Russia, China, and India, which may be the obvious examples, but they also include countries like the European Union. Germany, Italy, and France do not permit the separation of a part of their territory, and nor does, as I mentioned, most of the world. So the referendum of the 1st of October 2017 then showed that Spain had no intention of negotiating, and the international community had no intention of intervening. And I think this was particularly apparent in that Catalan independence, and I think this is probably its greatest political error, has never obtained 50% electoral support in any election. The best it has done is 48%, yet it tried to break with Spain with 48% support, with a country that Spain that was clear that it was never going to allow it to leave, and a very, at best, a naive belief that international support was imminent or on the horizon. And I think all of these elements come together and mean that what we're talking about now is a clear and dramatic political defeat for the cause of independence. So since late 2017, Catalan independence has been in crisis. And the events of the autumn of 2017 mark, as I said, a political defeat. And accepting this defeat has been very difficult for the political culture to accept. Some are in denial. Others have accepted it and recognise that they need to rethink strategy and try again. So if you're following at all Catalan politics, Catalan developments, there are really two major strands now of how to approach the question of independence. So in general, though, the Catalan independence movement is deeply divided today. It's internally fragmented, it's internally divided, and a divided political movement is and can only be an expression of weakness. From around 2012 until 2017, the Catalan independence movement was a highly positive and optimistic movement. It provided, it provided an optimistic political narrative, and that optimism has been lost. However, never rule out decisions made in Madrid. I mentioned at the beginning of this talk, and I'm coming very much to the end of it now, that the problem began in Madrid, and the problem in a sense, continues because of Madrid. Because what happened after the referendum? Spanish legal institutions, the Spanish legal authorities, Spanish judges chose to put on trial, with the support of the then Conservative government, those leading political figures, leading Catalan political figures, put them on trial for organising this illegal referendum. And over the course of 2019, a trial of important Catalan leaders was held, and the judgment was issued in October 2019. And suddenly we see incredibly harsh sentences of up to 13 years imprisonment for political leaders who say all we did was try to organise a democratic vote. And sectors of Catalan society exploded in rage. And once again, the Catalan issue came back onto our screens. This example is from October 2017, when a mass protest movement occupied the airport of Barcelona. We saw extensive rioting in the streets of Barcelona for substantial, for several weeks, intense disruption, intense powerful expression of the anger felt by Catalan society. Catalan society, if you want, exploded in rage at this decision to hand out these incredibly harsh sentences. So to finish then, to summarize so many of the things I've said, the Catalan question has its own peculiarities, but it is, of course, part of the wider political crisis that we see around us everywhere in Europe and in other parts of the world. Spaniards are deeply attached to a traditional conception of their state, their nation, and its territorial integrity. The unity of Spain is an essential component of who and what they are. Looking forwards then, never say never, of course. I think the past few years have taught us that so many things that we thought were unpredictable can come to pass, including what's happened in this incredible year of COVID. But I think if we analyze the data, analyze the, if you want, the structural forces that currently exist, I think Catalan independence is a possibility in the future, but it remains, in my view, a low possibility and is probably not the most likely outcome. However, variables to consider will be, of course, should Scotland leave the United Kingdom in the years to come? That will obviously provide a new incentive. We don't know what the post-COVID world is going to be like in terms of how economies recover, how economies respond, kind of grievances that are going to accumulate. So looking at, if you want, you know, I'm not Nostradamus, I'm not a fortune teller, but looking at the kind of the runes that are available to me in December 2020, I think for the foreseeable future, Catalan independence is not on the horizon, but the Catalan question is absolutely not going away. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you very much. I always say to people at these talks, it always feels weird that we can't really finish with a round of applause just because of how Zoom is set up, and it always leaves this kind of silence at the end. But yeah, thank you very much to Dr. Dowling for that talk. I'm just going to quickly go over how the Q&A session is going to work now, just for anyone who hasn't been to one of our talks before. So obviously all of you guys are still muted. If you look in the participants tab, there's some little sort of emojis down at the bottom. And if you want to ask a question, just click on the little yes one, or I think if you click on more, there's one where you can raise your hand. If you'd like to do that, and just sort of signals to me that you want to ask a question, and then I can unmute you and we can just sort of do it one by one like that. So yeah, I think I'm going to be selfish and start off with a question because I've thought of one. But after that, anyone else who wants to go, just put their little emoji up, and I can unmute you. So my first one was going to be, I know you said you weren't going to talk too much about sort of the individuals of the movement.
Mhm.
But I just wanted to know if you mentioned the leaders got quite harsh sentences. Was there sort of a figure who was seen as like the face of the Catalan independence movement?
Yeah, well, yeah. I mean, one of the interesting things that happened. So the Catalan Parliament on the 27th of October declares independence, but it's really a symbolic declaration that they're incapable of following through. The then, if you want, Catalan Prime Minister, known as President of the regional government, Carles Puigdemont, he departs that weekend and he's still in exile. So he is probably the most prominent figure. He's now a member of the European Parliament. Spain tried to block him becoming a member of the European Parliament, but he himself and two others are members of the European Parliament. So he's been a kind of a thorn in the side, really, for the Spanish authorities, because they weren't able to put him on trial. They tried to have him have European arrest warrants, which were rejected in both Germany and Belgium. So the Spanish authorities have received kind of slaps across the face from other European countries, because they wanted to put the people were charged, incredible, of rebellion and sedition. That's what they were convicted of. They weren't convicted of rebellion, but that's what they were put on trial, and they were convicted of sedition and misuse of public funds. So it's a very, I mean, you know, Spain, as even if you're sympathetic to Spain, and, you know, I like Spain, I like going there and everything, Spain has played its hand pretty appallingly. You know, it's a great example of how to alienate people with these incredibly harsh sentences. So to go back to your original question, Carles Puigdemont, currently living in Belgium, he's probably the most important symbolic figure of Catalan independence.
Right. Okay, thank you. So yeah, anyone else? Please let me know if you'd like to ask a question. If not, I've already filled them up.
I think Rosie.
Rosie, yeah, go on. I think you can unmute yourself.
Hi, Andrew.
Hello.
Thank you so much for your talk. It was really interesting for me because I studied Spanish A level.
Okay.
Yeah, so I'm kind of really interested in this. And I wanted to ask you, so you were talking about Spanish nationalism and, you know, like the rise of, like, you know, certain far right nationalist groups such as Vox. You know, to what extent do you think that, like, the COVID pandemic is, you know, influence Spanish nationalism? Do you think that, like, it's going to create, like, a sense of unity for Spain, or do you think it is going to be even more fractious for them?
I think that's a really sort of complex question, because I think, to be honest, I don't think we really know what any society is going to be like post-COVID. We don't really know what are going to be. You know, it's a year like no other everywhere. It's clearly been incredibly dramatic in Spain, and Vox, you know, which you rightly mentioned, for those that don't know, that, you know, the far right political parties really capitalized on this push by the Catalans to try and achieve independence. It's one of the major elements that's given them kind of political traction. What you've also got, and I think this is where maybe the vectors of sort of Spanish politics are going to lie in the next year or two, are going to be sort of around questions to do with political authority, by which I mean that, you know, people are resisting confinement. You've had some serious protests in Spain organized by right-wing forces. People are resisting confinement, are resisting the measures. And I think we'll also see, and it's also part of that far-right narrative as well, is resisting vaccination.
Yeah.
That, you know, so we're likely to see this type of Vox continuing to peddle conspiracy theories around the vaccine, about confinement, about civil liberties, you know, the restrictions introduced by the government, because the government in Spain is, of course, is a centre-left coalition. So all weapons, I think, in their armory will be used to sort of try to undermine the current Spanish government. But I think because of COVID, the Catalan question has sort of dropped in salience. But I think, should we return to a relatively normal political environment, the Catalan question can only rise up in the agenda. And I think one of the things that's being spoken about by the Spanish government is to pardon the political prisoners, or the political leadership that's imprisoned, is to give them a complete pardon. And if they do that, that will be fuel to the fire for a party like Vox. That will be perceived as a betrayal of Spain, a betrayal of the Spanish nation, and they'll use that as a wedge, as a kind of a mechanism to attack the Spanish government and to build their own political support.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with you. It's really complex, but it's interesting. I find it quite intriguing, the rise of populism, and far right groups in Europe, in Hungary and whatever. And I think obviously Spain is notably quite an important one. So it's going to be interesting to see what happens. But yeah, thank you for answering my question.
You're welcome.
Right, anybody else? Sam, do you want to?
This is a bit more philosophy than this is more of a philosophical question, and you've kind of been doing, I guess, more speculation. But if you were to decide whether they should be independent or not, would you give them independence?
Would I give the Catalan independence?
Yeah,
well,
if it was your decision.
I sort of think that. Well, how could I put it? I'd say Brexit, the Brexit referendum, and we obviously don't want to go down that road, but the Brexit referendum has kind of taught me that referendums aren't necessarily the best mechanism for solving political division. And so I think because when a society is split down the middle, and Catalan society is split down the middle, if you look at the opinion polling, it's sort of half is supportive, half is divided. When it's such a big issue, really, whether, and the same in Scotland, really, I wonder whether you should have perhaps a slightly higher majority, whether you should be required to achieve 55 or 60% majority. So you aren't just saying to half of the country, you don't count. And I think that's kind of a political lesson that I think many of us have sort of derived from the Brexit referendum, the referendum of 2016 in the UK, where over half the population voted a certain way, and under half the population voted a different way. And we've seen British politics just so polarized, so divided since. And so I think independence is such a big issue. There's no turning back, is there? Once you separate from Spain, it's pretty much that's it. You're not going to ask to rejoin 20 years later. So it's a permanent separation, as it will be or would be in the case of Scotland. So I think you really need a strong consensus, I think, to try to achieve that. And so that's why there is an argument in the theory, they call it having a super majority. So a super majority might be, let's do this major change if we have 60% of the population in agreement, for example. And I think a 60-40 split is a fairer way of doing things than, say, a 50-50. So I think 50% plus one vote, when it's so existential like that, whether you're going to split a country or not, I think is just not quite enough. So hopefully I've kind of answered your question.
Is that a no then?
Sorry?
Oh yes, you did. Is
Okay.
that a no then? No, you did answer my question.
Okay, you're welcome.
Okay, next up we'll come to Luke.
Okay,
Hi, can you hear me?
I can. Yep.
Okay, just say thank you for the talk. So my question, not to stray too much from the Catalonia subject matter, but when we talk about sort of nationalism or sort of independence in the UK, we obviously talk about Scotland and the possibility of them gaining independence. But I wondered, and maybe this is more devolution than independence, but with the recent tier system coming back in, and the fact that, you know, there's that map of the UK and almost all of the north is just fully red, I wonder if maybe in the near future there's a possibility of people in the north, I guess not quite nationalist sort of views, but more a sense of needing more devolution to the north. I wondered if you thought maybe that's something that could happen in the next few years.
Yeah, I mean, I think in that kind of Rosie was hinting at in her question, I think it's clear that the COVID crisis has kind of strained political cultures kind of everywhere, and it's kind of strained and frayed the culture of Britain in a certain sense, you know, with different, I live in Wales, so, you know, different patterns, different implementations of policy and lockdown and all these things. So you've kind of got a fraying of the UK going on. And you've certainly got a very strong, what I would call regional grievance in the north. The north of England, it's not a nationalism, but it's a strong regional identity. And you have a Scottish Parliament, you've got a Welsh Parliament, you've got a Northern Irish Parliament, but you haven't got an English Parliament. And that's kind of an anomaly. And what's interesting is 20 years ago under Tony Blair, the North started up in I think Cumbria, was asked to vote on a Northern Parliament and it rejected it. And I think we may see that perhaps the support for that returns, that actually, I think part of the problem with when they tried to introduce these Northern Parliaments 20 years ago, or these regional parliaments, it was a top-down measure where Tony Blair's government said, we're going to change the structure of British local government and we're going to create all these regional authorities, and people kind of didn't feel very happy and they just thought it was another tier of bureaucracy. Whereas it'll be a very different thing, to answer your question, is if, say, there's a popular push in the north of England to have their own regional parliament. That's a very different thing, because then that's a bottom-up response, and that can have much more kind of political effectiveness. If it's bottom-up, not top-down, it has a very different, you know, a different possibility of success, basically.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I think.
Not to hog the floor a bit, but do you think that would be a good thing? Like, do you think more representation, maybe in Northern Assembly, do you think that would be beneficial?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, I'm not Welsh, but I live in Wales, and I think having, as far as possible, kind of governmental decisions made as close to where you live as possible, I think is always a good principle. Yeah. You know, it can't necessarily work for everything, but I think there's no reason why you couldn't have an effective Northern Parliament that could make all sorts of decisions, whether, you know, economic or political or structural, or, you know, building of kind of roads and rail and all these things, cultural, you know, all these areas can be best decided perhaps by people in the north of England rather than by civil servants in London. I mean, I think that, for me, that sort of goes without saying. And I think, you know, think local, you know, is a good way of approaching things, without forgetting that, you know, that we also have kind of bonds of community with people elsewhere.
Yep, I'd agree with that. Thank you for answering my question.
That's okay, you're welcome.
Okay, I think Naris, did you want to ask something?
Hello. I have two questions.
Sure.
The first one will be, can a people be proud and independent while still being of a part of a larger country with other people? That's
Okay.
The first one.
Okay. Well, you could say we have the example of Latvia as part of the Soviet Union for 50 years, and the answer is probably no. I mean, if you're part of a larger country, there are always going to be limits to how you can develop. And I think, although I didn't quite use that expression, I think one of the things that's happened in the Catalan question is a kind of, where should political decisions about Catalonia be made? Should they be made in Madrid or should they be made in Barcelona? So it kind of echoes what Luke was just saying about the kind of regional tier in the north of England, that it makes sense for as many decisions as possible to be made at the level where the issues are going to be implemented or going to be applied. Can you feel pride? I think you can feel pride if you're respected. And I think if you had any Catalans here, or you spoke to many Catalans, they'd say, we're not respected by Spain. They don't respect our language, or they don't respect our culture, or they don't respect our identity. So it takes two to tango. Yes, it is theoretically possible to feel your own national pride within a larger entity. but that larger entity also has to be respectful towards you. And I think, for example, Canada would be an example that has probably achieved that. But you said you had 2 questions?
Yeah, the second one, like, I just didn't want to jumble them up. Can there be a unifying national identity for like different people? Like, for example, in UK, there's been talks about like lack of unifying identity. And the same way, like in Spain, could all people in a country arrive to an identity that lets like them coexist, and also like, you know, immigrants becoming part of the country somehow?
Yeah, I mean, again, that's you know, like a really kind of big, almost existential question. That if you live in a banlieue in the outskirts of Paris, you know, what is French identity to you? Well, French identity for you might be kind of on the receiving end of a police truncheon. So these things, I think these things can only work if there's mutual respect. And that kind of echoes what I said to you in my first answer. Yes, you can create a kind of plural, open British identity that can include everybody, but it has to have that kind of ability to be plural. You could create a Spanish identity that happily includes the Basques, the Catalans, and others, but they haven't achieved it yet, and that requires not the Catalans to necessarily change. It requires a substantial number of people in Spain to change their perceptions. They need to value the Basque language or the Catalan language as something intrinsic to Spanish identity, not just the Spanish language. You can't just have a British conception of identity that's kind of World War II and all this kind of stuff, you know, and the monarchy and all these kind of traditional symbols, and then say, why don't people identify with these symbols? If you want to create an inclusive identity, you have to have inclusive, open and changing symbols. So the change has to come from kind of within British nationalism or within Spanish nationalism. They have to say, we have to create a more open movement. That's kind of what I'd say, but I think it's the kind of thing that is a vast and complex question that has major implications for, as I said, countries like France and many others. You know, we see a similar thing in the United States of America in recent years. Who is American? Who has the right to be American? Who defines American identity? Who has the right to define American identity? When do you include? When do you exclude? So these themes of inclusion and exclusion are essential, and they have to be kind of discussed and debated and negotiated if you want to kind of achieve that kind of open, welcoming environment.
Thank you. That answered my questions.
You're welcome.
Okie dokie. Anyone else would like to ask a question? Okay, Rosie, you want to ask another one?
Yes, please. Hi. So I've just been thinking, you know, you've been talking about, you know, different things, and I think what came to mind for me anyway is thinking about, you know, perhaps simply as we can, you know, how much I think Spain is different from, you know, other countries like the UK, because obviously they suffered with a dictatorship for so long. So I guess my question to you is kind of like, how much do you think, you know, Franco's dictatorship has, you know, affected countries like Catalonia and the Basque Country to kind of want independence, not only, you know, for their own like economic gain or whatever, but also perhaps to kind of almost like taking back their culture, which I think Franco very much, you know, dulled down for them and dampened. But yeah, I don't know, just want to pass that to you.
No, sure. I mean, I think, you know, it's clear that there are still wounds in Basque society, in Catalan society, and in parts of Spain from the Franco dictatorship. And I always think, again, going back to British politics, Tony Blair in the early 2000s, he issued an apology on behalf of the British government for the Irish famine that happened in the 1840s. You know, he said that, you know, what happened then should never have happened. and things like that. And I think Spain, the Spanish authorities or a Spanish government could say the Franco regime, committed crimes against sort of the Basques and the Catalans, and as today's representatives of the Spanish authorities, we apologize to you for that, because these have never been apologized for. They've never, nobody, even in the Franco dictatorship, even when it ended and go to the transition, nobody in Spain, not one person has even spent 5 minutes in prison for anything that happened in the Franco dictatorship. You've still got police torturers still alive and all this stuff. So there's never been a resolution of those problems, and perhaps there are a variety of reasons that didn't happen. But you have historical grievances, and they continue if they're never addressed. And in my view, it's incumbent on the Spanish authorities to one day, put their hands up and say, we apologize for the crimes of the Franco dictatorship, although we didn't do them as representatives of Spain. And, that allows a kind of closure, even if people can't necessarily, you can't change the past, but you can at least say, this allows us to move forwards as a country.
Yeah, I mean, I think I remember, obviously I've done my Spanish A level a few years ago now, but I remember learning about something called like El Pacto de Olvidar, which was like the Pact of Forgetting, which I think the right-wing government that got in at the time like implemented to like forget what happened. And I just thought it was like crazy to me, because if you look at like Germany and the responsibility they took for the Nazi party, I just think like Spain, to me it was just like a complete opposite, so yeah. I was just like, no, it's crazy.
Like after the end of apartheid in South Africa, you have a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and that Truth and Reconciliation Commission, it didn't put anybody on trial. It just said, tell us your story as a policeman, as a torturer. What did you do?
Yeah.
So the facts are or the events are out there and are spoken about, and it allows a society to kind of heal. Spain's never been through that process.
Yeah, it's interesting. Thank you.
Well, I've just thought of another question. So I was going to say, you mentioned that one of the main things that happened in 2017 was the Catalan independence sort of question reached sort of like international fame and got a lot of international attention. How badly did that affect the image of the Spanish government at the time? Like, were they seen internationally as a sort of tyrannical oppressors of the Catalan people?
Yeah, definitely. And they tried to wheel out kind of government spokesmen saying that the images were fake. And you could, if you look it up, you'll see BBC interviews or German TV, and various people say, but I was there. I saw with my own eyes the police hitting these protesters, and so it did incredible damage to the image of Spain. It really did. And maybe we live in a kind of a world where kind of people forget kind of what happened 2 months ago or something. But for a time, it did enormous damage to the reputation of Spain. As I said at the beginning, most people have a broadly positive image of Spain and Spaniards, so it did a lot of damage. Ordinary Spaniards were embarrassed by the terrible. I just showed you some images, but there are hundreds of videos online, and it's clear that this isn't fake. This was unrestrained. This was terrible policing. It was unrestrained police violence. These were police lashing out at innocent protesters. So it did incredible damage. I think the problem is that since, of course, we've had things like the yellow vests in France, and the actions of the French police have been even more extreme. Like the scale of violence unleashed by the French police against the yellow vest protests for the past couple of years have been incredible. So I don't know whether there's a danger of normalizing police violence as well with all of this, that we become kind of a bit immune to it. But to answer your question directly, yeah, it did great damage to Spain's international image, and that they've even got this laughable marketing campaign called Global Spain, where they get kind of Spanish film stars or directors or writers talking about how wonderful Spain is, you know. And I think if you need to employ a PR agency to improve your global image, you've got a problem, you know. So yeah, so it's España Global, it's called Global Spain.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, it's laughable. It's like, you know, just don't draw attention to yourself. It makes you sound like a dictatorship if you're having to do that kind of video to say we're actually a really nice country.
Sort of wheeling out the Spanish version of Goebbels to kind of.
Well, I wouldn't go that far, but yeah. But yeah, to try to massage the image, shall we say.
Yeah. Right, any other questions from anybody? Well, I think we've come up to about the hour mark now, I think. So I think if there's no other further questions, I think it'd be quite good to wrap up there.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much for coming. Again, I'd really love to give you a round of applause for such a brilliant talk, but it just doesn't come out very well over Zoom. But yeah, thank you so much for coming. We've had a really wonderful time. It's been really sort of informative, especially for me, about the whole situation. Yeah, thank you very much again. And yeah, I hope you have a wonderful night.
Thank you. And you.
Yeah, thank you
Thanks,
so
everyone.
much.
Thank you for your time.
And thanks for all your questions.
Thank you.
Thank you.